안녕하세요. Hello, my name is Eric Weiner, and I am delighted to be joining you at the Seoul International Book Fair. I wish it could be in person, but this is the next best thing. I know there are a lot of book lovers out there, and I'm just very happy to be speaking with you. I'm going to be speaking today mainly about my best-selling book, The Socrates Express, in search of life lessons from dead philosophers. This is the US edition of the book, in English of course. My Korean publisher has done a beautiful job of designing the Korean edition, and I just love the cover and the artwork that they've come up for the book. And I think you will find it's not only a great book to read, but an aesthetically, visually appealing book to have on your bookshelf, or to throw in your backpack, or to just have it sitting on your coffee table. So I'm going to talk about the book, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit differently. I'm not going to tell you exactly what's in the book. You can read it and find that out. I'm going to tell you what we call in America the backstory. The backstory is the story behind the story. How I came to write the book, what motivated me, what my process was like, some of the challenges I had, how I went about the writing and the research, and really how I made certain decisions to come up with the finished product that hopefully you'll read and enjoy. So this is my fourth book actually, and a common theme in my book is that I am interested in the world of ideas. I've written about happiness and spirituality and creativity, and now wisdom. And wisdom is sort of the biggest idea, because I think all those other elements fall under the umbrella of wisdom. You know, wisdom is different from knowledge. You know, knowledge is facts and information. Wisdom is what we do with them. It's how we navigate the world. There was a British musician who put it this way, he said that knowledge is knowing that the tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. So wisdom is practical. It's what allows us to, as I said, navigate life's challenges. And there are many sources of wisdom, and I've written about them. Religion is certainly one source, and people find great inspiration and wisdom from religious practice. That works for some people. The field of psychology and social science and the studies they do, people find a lot of helpfulness in that field. But there is one ancient source of wisdom that is often overlooked in our world today, and that's philosophy. Now, maybe you took a philosophy course in university, and maybe you found it difficult or boring, or it wasn't your cup of tea, really. I think that is not philosophy's fault, but to be honest, your teacher's fault, because philosophy is a fascinating field, and it's not some esoteric subject that has nothing to do with our lives. This is the reputation of philosophy. In fact, it's the most practical thing you can study, because the word philosophy in English comes from the ancient Greek word philosophia, which means love of wisdom. A philosopher, therefore, is someone who loves wisdom, not knowledge, but wisdom. And I love wisdom, and I'm hungry for wisdom, and I think we all are. I mean, we have these gadgets, iPhones, Samsung phones, and tablets and laptops that contain all of human knowledge really at our fingertips. But are we any happier? Are we any wiser? Not necessarily. In fact, there is such a thing as too much knowledge and too much information. A friend of mine calls it data smog. You know, it can cloud our vision. It creates noise. We can't hear the signal, the music, if there's too much noise around us. So philosophy is a way to cut through that noise. So I knew that I wanted to write a book on philosophy, but a different kind of book. One that is more accessible, that has a lighter touch than a lot of books on philosophy, one that's entertaining. I think a book should be entertaining. And I also wanted to write a book about philosophy that's practical, so that when you put the book down, you could improve your life in small ways and big ways. So that's why I decided to arrange the book in 14 chapters. Each chapter begins with a how-to question. And these are very basic, simple, everyday how-to questions, starting with chapter 1, how to get out of bed, like Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman philosopher and statesman, emperor actually. How to wonder, like Socrates. How to walk, like Rousseau. How to see, like Henry David Thoreau. Others, like how to fight, like Gandhi. How to be kind, like Confucius. And how to have no regrets, like Nietzsche. And finally, questions like how to grow old, like Simone de Beauvoir, and how to die, like Montaigne. And I divided these 14 into 3 sections: dawn, noon, and dusk. It's the arc of a day, but it mirrors the arc of our lives. So there are how-to questions that are really important to us when we're young. How to walk and how to see. I mean, this is what we learn as a child. And then there are questions that are important to us in the prime of our life. How to fight, how to pay attention, how to appreciate the small things. And then there are questions that are really relevant in the dusk of our life, toward the end of our lives. How to cope, how to grow old, and yes, as I said, how to die. So each chapter is self-contained. You don't need to know anything about these philosophers. I give you a little mini biography of them, but it's filtered through me, because this is a personal book. This is not a textbook. This is not an academic book. Philosophy is personal, should be personal. It should matter to you on a personal level. So I'm interpreting these philosophers, I'm encountering them. I'm not studying them exactly, although I've read what they had to write and I've read about them, but I'm really think of it as an encounter with another human being. Now, the subtitle of the book is In Search of Life Lessons from Dead Philosophers. Well, why dead? Because I think it actually takes time to recognize wisdom. There may be very wise philosophers and people out there now, but we don't always recognize it right away. It takes some time for them to age, like a good bottle of wine. And the thing about wisdom is that it ages very well. Now, that's not true of like the smartphone, which you probably have in your hand right now. That thing is going to be obsolete by the end of this video, and you're going to need to get the newest, latest one. That's not true of wisdom. The lessons from the ancient philosophers through the ages, they're just as relevant today, more relevant today than ever, because they were humans like us, and they suffered for the same reasons, and they rejoiced for the same reasons, and they practiced and sought out wisdom for the same reasons. So philosophy and wisdom age very well, unlike your smartphone. So that's why dead philosophers. Why 14? Why not 40 or 50 or 100 or 3 or 5? I wanted to have enough of a sampling of philosophers so that you really could experience different approaches to philosophy, whether it was someone who was very much an empiricist like Epicurus, or someone who was a Stoic like Epictetus, someone who lived thousands of years ago like Socrates, some 2,500 years ago, or someone who died fairly recently. Simone de Beauvoir didn't die until the 1980s, really in my lifetime and maybe in your lifetime too, not that long ago. So I wanted the span of the ages, and I wanted the span geographically. So we in the West may have invented the word philosophy, philosophia, but we have no monopoly on wisdom, of course. So I included 3 Asian philosophers, actually. Mahatma Gandhi from India, of course, and Sei Shonagon from Japan, who was a courtier and a writer in Kyoto, which was then the capital of Japan, at about 1000 AD. And Confucius, of course, who you're familiar with, included him as well. So I wanted to show that wisdom spans the ages, it spans the globe, different parts of the world. And I wanted philosophers who wrestled with different questions. I didn't want it to be all about how to listen. I wanted Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher, to give us his thoughts on that subject. Now, it's called the Socrates Express, and on the cover of the Korean edition and the US edition, there's a train motif. And so you're probably wondering, what's up with the trains? Well, I've been a traveler all my life and a travel writer, and I am what I call a place person. I really think in terms of place. So I knew I was going to travel for this book. And the question was where? The question also was how, because how we travel matters probably even more than where we travel. Are we zipping through on an airplane at 600 miles an hour? Are we driving? Are we walking? Are we taking a train? And I love trains. Not the technology per se. I'm not, one of those train nerds who knows everything about locomotives and how they operate. I don't really know how they operate, but I know that I love sitting on a train and riding on a train because it slows me down. And good philosophy is slow philosophy. I find that on a train, I can think. I cannot think on an airplane at 30,000 feet, not even a little bit. So what I did is I took a train around the world, essentially. There were oceans I could not cross by train, but whenever I could take a train, I did. I took a train clear across the US from Washington, D.C. to Portland, Oregon, a journey that takes 4 days and 3 nights, and is wonderful. I took a train across half of India. I took a train all the way from Athens in Greece to Copenhagen in Denmark, a long train ride. I took the Shinkansen, the bullet train in Japan from Tokyo to Kyoto. And I use the train as a running theme in my book and as a way to transport you, the reader, from one philosophy to another, from one philosopher to another. And I want to add that, I wrote this book, I researched and wrote this book before the pandemic. I obviously, like all of us, did not see that coming. But it came out in the middle of the pandemic, and I think that's actually a kind of a good thing in a way, because I think the book has provided people with a lot of comfort and help and wisdom during the pandemic. The opening quote in my book, that little quote that is in the very early pages, is from a French philosopher named Maurice Riesling. And he says, sooner or later, life makes philosophers of us all. I think that's very wise. And all I can say is welcome to sooner. I think we have all grown a little more philosophical, and maybe a lot more philosophical over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, since the pandemic first broke out in China. We've all had time to stop and ask questions, big questions that we may not have asked before. Am I leading the kind of life I want to lead? If not, why not? And what can I do about it? What is the source of happiness, of truth, of beauty? Difficult times like these often lead us into new avenues in our life. We ask new questions. And it's called the Socrates Express, really because Socrates wasn't the first philosophers came before him, but he was the first philosopher to, as it's been said, bring philosophy down from the heavens and introduce it into people's homes. That's what I'm trying to do too, to introduce philosophy into your life. And what Socrates did in ancient Athens is he essentially asked questions. This is what all philosophers do. They ask questions, but they ask in a certain way. They'll question assumptions, and we all have assumptions. You're probably walking around with assumptions right now, and they're really deeply ingrained assumptions. We don't even know we have them. It's like having blue eyes, and unless you look in the mirror, you forget you have blue eyes, or you forget if you wear your watch every day, you might forget you're wearing it. This is what I'm talking about, these kinds of assumptions. And they're okay to have, but we also need to know we have them and to question them, because maybe they're wrong assumptions, or they're assumptions that are not helping us. In the case of Socrates, he would go around Athens and ask a general, what is courage? And the general couldn't really answer. Or a poet, what is beauty? And the poet didn't really know. Oh, they thought they knew, but they didn't really know. And Socrates exposed their ignorance. People don't really like that, and it did not end well for Socrates. He was executed by his fellow Athenians, essentially from asking questions. So yes, you have to be quite careful sometimes about how you ask questions, but in general, that is what drives philosophy, and that sense of wonder. Wonder is important. Curiosity and wonder. That sense of wanting to know why things are and how they might be different. And these are some of the themes I explore in my book. And some of the philosophers I think are particularly relevant to our times are, yes, Socrates and how to wonder, because we don't want to lose that. How to walk, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Swiss 18th century Swiss philosopher. He would walk for 20, 30 miles a day and think nothing of it. And he carried little playing cards with him and a pen, and he would write down ideas as they came to him. Maybe you've noticed this too, that when you're walking, the ideas come to you. And during the pandemic, walking is one of the activities that we could still do safely. Go out and go for long walks. And there's something about the act of walking that makes us wonder, that makes us ask questions, that makes us philosophize. So that's certainly relevant. How to see, like Henry David Thoreau, the sort of nugget of wisdom here is that we sometimes have to change our perspective. And Thoreau would do this. He was living in America in the 19th century on Walden Pond, and he would sometimes turn his head to one side to look at the pond differently. And sometimes he would even bend over. So he's peering between his legs, and he looked at the pond upside down. And when he did that, he saw beautiful things that were always there, but he didn't notice them. So that's Thoreau. How to listen like Schopenhauer, a particularly important skill these days when we tend not to listen to each other, but just talk over them, talk over other people. How to enjoy like Epicurus. In English, we say someone's an Epicurean if they like gourmet food, but this is wrong. This is not the way of Epicurus. He in fact believed in life's simple pleasures, that's how we enjoy the most, through simplicity. How to pay attention like Simone Weil, French philosopher. How to fight like Gandhi. Gandhi is one of my heroes, and I will show you his way of fighting, non-violently but very assertively. How to be kind like Confucius. How to appreciate the small things like Sei Shonagon. How to have no regrets like Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century German philosopher, and he devised a thought experiment, which I think is tremendously helpful. He said, what if someone came to you and said, excuse me, but you're going to repeat your life over and over again for all eternity, exactly the same way, every moment, including watching this video. You'll repeat that for infinity, over and over again. Would you consider this a blessing or a curse? And he was partly serious in that he believed that it was possible that the universe repeats itself. And there's ancient myths that tell us that might be true, and some scientific evidence, a little shaky, that it might be true. But really, I think it was a thought experiment, because if every moment is an eternal moment, you think about it differently. And do you really want to have that second drink of sake or shochu or not? Maybe you have to relive that hangover the next day over and over again. Do you really want to get angry at that person? It's a way of thinking about the everyday moments in our life. And to me, it's about acceptance. It's about how do you accept your whole life? Because in Nietzsche's thought experiment, your life repeats itself with every little detail, the good and the bad. Now, my daughter said she would, like to edit out the bad parts and repeat the good parts, but that's not what Nietzsche said. It's all or nothing. So it's an interesting way of looking at life. How to cope like the Stoics. The Stoic philosophy is very relevant to our time. In a nutshell, really condensed, Stoicism says this: we have absolutely zero control over events. Zero. We do not control if there's going to be a pandemic, or if there's going to be a wildfire, or anything. But what we do control is our reactions to those events. We have a lot less control over external events than we think, but a lot more control over internal events. Do we get upset? Do we lash out in anger? We have much more control over that than we think. And that is the essence of Stoic philosophy, which is extremely helpful, obviously, during the pandemic, where we don't control the virus and the mutations and the variants. We don't control any of that, but we can control our internal reactions. It's not easy, but the Stoics teach us that it is possible to do that. And briefly, I want to talk about some overlap between this book, The Socrates Express, and my other book, probably my most popular here in the US, The Geography of Bliss, One Grump's Search for the Happiest Places in the World, which will be released again in Korea shortly. And you may be wondering, well, what's the overlap or what's the connection between philosophy, wisdom, and happiness? And I think there's a lot of overlap, but it's not 100%. And happiness is important, but the way we use the word, especially here in America, has diluted it. We talk about happiness as kind of fun and pleasure, but the ancient Greeks had something else in mind. For them, happiness and wisdom were married, or were joined together, and you couldn't really be happy if you weren't wise. And so I think actually philosophy is the love of wisdom. It's also the love of happiness. And in the Geography of Bliss, I travel around the world looking for the happiest places. And I only realize now, looking back at it, that I was also looking for the wisest places, that there was no distinction between happy places and wise places. And finally, I just want to say that when I was asked to give this talk at the Seoul International Book Festival, I was really honored and pleased, partly because my book has been so successful and unexpectedly so in Korea, which is wonderful, but also because I have this strange connection with Korea and the Korean people. So my father, who passed away recently, was a US Army doctor stationed in Uijeongbu in Korea in the 1960s. And it was a very pivotal time in his life. He did a lot of good. He helped a lot of people. He learned a lot from the Korean people. And he came back hungry for porgogi all the time, and talking about his love of Korea and the Korean people. And that, I was only 5 or 6 years old at the time, and he came back in love with Korea, and I think that rubbed off on me a bit. Years later, I'm a foreign correspondent for American radio network, National Public Radio, and I'm based in Tokyo, but I'm taking many trips to Seoul and Busan and even North Korea. And I am spending a lot of time in Korea and reconnecting with now very modern country. And then just a couple of years ago, my teenage daughter, I found that she was teaching herself Korean, the Hangul alphabet. I'm like, Sonia, why are you learning Korean? And she said, because of K-pop. So she's a huge K-pop fan. And we recently took a trip just before the pandemic to Seoul to experience K-pop. We saw Psy in concert, and so it's particularly nice that my book is doing so well in Korea and has so many readers. Maybe it's what the Indians call kismet, fate. So with that, I will just say 감사합니다, and I hope you have a chance to enjoy my book, The Socrates Express, in search of life lessons from dead philosophers, as well as my other books. Thank you very much.